Hi, everybody. Welcome to English Digest. I'm Stephanie.
I'm Tom.
It's our psychology unit, and we're going to be talking about childhood bullying. When you bully someone, you usually are someone who is stronger than the person that you're teasing or making fun of or trying to insult. There's all sorts of bullying that happens these days. There's a lot of online bullying, as you know. We're going to be talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. You often see this acronym when we talk about soldiers who have seen horrible traumatic things during war and come back and have a hard time fitting into, their normal lives again. Some of them have nightmares a lot, and some suffer from a lot of depression. It can be very, very debilitating, very difficult for family members.
Indeed, and I think a lot of people probably think, oh, bullying, what's the big deal? Kids make fun of each other all the time. Just laugh it off, shake it off. It shouldn't be so serious. But actually, I've heard lots of stories of people who were bullied back in school, and of course, they've suffered a lot from that. They don't dare leave home. They don't dare go out and look for jobs and stuff like that because bullying affected their lives so much. So the next time you decide to pick on the kid that everybody else is picking on, think about the lifelong consequences that kid might have to suffer. So let's get to it here. Let's read through the entire contents of our lesson now, and then we'll be right back to talk about it.
When something traumatic happens to us, we can end up suffering long after the event. It's long been known that post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, affects soldiers, many of whom continue to suffer the brutal consequences of war after returning home. From nightmares and terrifying flashbacks to chronic depression and anxiety, PTSD is a mental illness that can last years if left untreated. PTSD affects people from all walks of life, though, not just those in the military. Survivors of natural disasters, domestic violence, and childhood bullying can all face PTSD after their traumatic experiences. Childhood bullying, in fact, can cause many more problems later in life than we are led to believe. Dr. Andre Sarander, a professor of child psychology at Finland's University of Turku, published some startling findings in JAMA Psychiatry in 2012. Sarander found that 23% of the bullied children he tracked sought help for a mental illness by the age of 30. With some U.S. studies showing that up to 28% of children between grades 6 and 12 are bullied, bullying-related PTSD is clearly a problem that can't be ignored. Besides the injuries that may result from physical bullying, the humiliating or mean comments and behaviors that bullies employ can cause a range of emotions, from mild embarrassment to extreme fear. Adult survivors may continue to experience powerlessness, anger, and even terror. These feelings might manifest as nightmares, social anxiety, panic attacks, avoidance of certain situations and behaviors, and the development of risky coping mechanisms, all of which are characteristic of PTSD. These problems can have dreadful consequences, affecting people's health, career, and relationships.
Okay, let's dive into this and discuss the contents of our lesson for today. It's all about childhood bullying, and if you want to survive childhood bullying, it's harder than it looks, okay? So again, bullying is when people treat you in a cruel way, especially when you're in school. If you're kind of shy and not very big or something, you can be an easy target for the school bullies. And like I began at the program here, a lot of people kind of think this is no big deal, that you just should shake it off and forget all about it, but it does cause scars that stay with you for the rest of your life. So it's very difficult to survive childhood bullying. And let's go into the first paragraph here. It says, when something traumatic happens to us, we can end up suffering long after the event. So traumatic here is an adjective. It just refers to something that is very dangerous. It causes a lot of harm. That's why hospitals have a trauma center, because people are suffering greatly from some kind of physical problem.
Yeah, trauma. It's emotionally disturbing or distressing. So sometimes in the hospital, of course, they'll have physical injuries. But if they're traumatized, they're also experiencing emotional distress. So they're kind of trying to treat both of the problems at once. So when something traumatic happens to us, we can end up suffering long after the event. It's not just that one period of time. When we go through it, it comes back to us for years and years. So it's long been known that post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, affects soldiers. Post, if you see this word post connected to other words, it means after. So after some sort of traumatic situation, they experience stress disorder. We use this word disorder when we talk about something that isn't working right mentally or physically, but we don't call it a disease. It's a disorder that hopefully you can get some therapy for and it can improve. So PTSD, I'm sure a lot of our listeners have heard that acronym a lot. Usually, in the past at least, we've talked about it in connection with soldiers who experience the horrors of war, which is just awful. And after they come home, it says many of whom, these soldiers, continue to suffer the brutal consequences of war after returning home. Tom, what does brutal mean?
It's just something really terrible. It involves a lot of violence. And, of course, there can be blood and pain and stuff like that. It's something that's really hard and uncomfortable to deal with. You could also use it for situations. It doesn't have to refer only to physical violence. You could say, oh my goodness, that conversation class I had this morning was brutal. The students did not do their homework. They were not cooperating at all. It was just a terrible class. It was brutal. And maybe the storm could be brutal. Oh, there's a brutal hurricane out there. We got to watch out for that. But in any case, if you're suffering from PTSD, you might suffer from these brutal consequences mentally after you return from home. I think they often refer to PSD affecting usually veterans of wars. In the U.S., of course, we've got Vietnam veterans and veterans who return from Afghanistan and Iraq, and a lot of them suffer from PTSD. I haven't really heard about it so much here in Taiwan.
Now, it says here from nightmares and terrifying flashbacks to chronic depression and anxiety. PTSD is a mental illness that can last years if left untreated, not getting some help or therapy for it. So we've got a range of things that people who are suffering from PTSD experience. Maybe they're having really bad nightmares at night. I've heard of some of these soldiers coming home, waking up and thinking someone's attacking them and actually hurting a spouse by thinking they're the enemy. So those can be really hard, not on just the person suffering, but the family. And they can also have terrifying flashbacks. A flashback is when you've experienced something traumatic and you remember it as if it's happening for real in lifetime again. So it can be very terrifying. Terrifying is an adjective. It's a greater degree of being scared than just saying, oh, I'm scared. If something is terrifying, you're so frightened you can't even move. It's just a greater degree of feeling scared. So it causes extreme fear. So terrifying, something is terrifying, or a person is terrified. Now, if you're talking about someone who's really scary and mean, you can use that word terrifying to talk about a person. But if you're personally scared, you would say, I'm terrified. If someone who's doing something really awful to you is mean and cruel, they can be terrifying.
That's right, and we're describing these flashbacks as being terrifying. And, of course, these people are also having bad dreams or nightmares. And, of course, they also suffer from chronic depression. Depression, of course, means you feel really sad about something. But if it's chronic, that means it lasts for a long time and doesn't seem to go away. And, of course, anxiety is just feeling scared all the time and nervous. So, yes, indeed, we're listing this as a mental illness that can last years if left untreated. Now, moving on to the next paragraph here, it says, PTSD affects people from all walks of life, though, not just those in military or in the military, not just those in military uniforms. So if you're talking about people from all walks of life, we're just talking about all kinds of people, men, women, children, adults, all different races, all different ages, rich, poor, etc. So those are just basically all people from all different stations of life.
Yeah, all walks of life. You'll see that used quite often. We're not just talking about the military. We're talking about people in all sorts of different situations in life. So survivors, people who have survived things like natural disasters, that would include typhoons, it would include earthquakes, volcano eruptions. I was seeing that the other day in the news, which is scary. Domestic violence, where someone that they should be feeling safe with, a family member, is actually beating them up or saying really awful things. You can be verbally abused, not just physically abused, mentally abused. Childhood bullying also comes or falls under this category. These folks can all face PTSD after their traumatic experiences, is what we talked about. So even after the horrible event is over and long behind them, they can still have these awful nightmares and these flashbacks, which is tough for them. We're going to be continuing to talk about this, guys, but right now it's a good time to take a break. We'll listen to our Chinese teacher, and then we'll return.
大家好，我是派老师。今天讲解的是8月份 Unit 7，Surviving Childhood Bullying is Harder than It Looks。这个单元所谈的主题是 bullying 霸凌。好，那我们请看到第二句。It's long been known that post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, affects soldiers, many of whom... 好的，同学，请特别注意这个 many of whom。这个 whom 是关系代名词，可是呢，因为它在介系词的后面，这个 of 的后面，所以我们用关系代名词的受格 whom, W-H-O-M， 它所代替的呢，就是前面的士兵。好，接着请同学继续往后看 Suffer the brutal consequences， 请把它画起来 Suffer， 同学对它的不及物动词用法 Suffer from a disease， 这个应该相当清楚，但是 Suffer 也有及物动词的用法，就像这里 Suffer the brutal consequences， 那他们呢遭遇到什么？战后非常残忍的后果，战争所造成的非常残酷的结果。好，接着请同学看到第三个句子 from nightmares 一直到 if left untreated。请同学特别注意的是，这里的 if left untreated 其实是有所省略的。省略了什么呢？前面 if 和 left 中间，请同学帮我补回去，有个 it is。If it is left untreated， 这里的 it is 的 it 所代替的就是 PTSD。如果 PTSD 放着不去治疗，如果你不去治疗它，那这边 untreated 其实呢就是什么？前面这个 PTSD， 那我们现在用 it 来代替它的主词补语。如果放着 PTSD 不去治疗的话，
We're going to take a quick break. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Okay, let's continue to talk about childhood bullying and surviving it into adulthood. So we just introduced this topic by introducing something called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. We talked about the fact that it mostly affects soldiers, but we began to say that it also affects people from all walks of life, not just soldiers. And we gave you some examples: survivors of natural disasters, of domestic violence, and childhood bullying. And that's our subject for today. So childhood bullying, in fact, can cause many more problems later in life than we are led to believe. So we might be thinking, well, yeah, everybody's bullied in school, just forget about it. They didn't mean anything. They're just kids, but actually we're learning nowadays that people remember this stuff and it affects them for life. And so, of course, it can cause many more problems later in life than we are led to believe. I think most of us probably were told to downplay childhood bullying. Don't worry about it if, the big bully, Big Mac, beat you up after school or something like that.
Did that ever happen to you, Tom?
No, actually, I think I was spared from bullying pretty much.
You're kind of a big guy. I wouldn't ever take you
Well,
on.
I wasn't always a big guy.
Oh, yeah?
But my father ran a business in my hometown, so I think maybe that's because maybe that's why I was left alone. But maybe some other people were bullied, and I hate to say this, but maybe I bullied someone and didn't really know it. So maybe someone out there is suffering because of what I did to them. I don't think I did.
I think sometimes kids don't think enough about what they're doing.
Yeah, you just kind of do what everybody else is doing. So we might all be guilty at some point. But in any case, yes, it can cause lots of other problems in life.
Yeah, it sure can. We didn't have a lot of bullying where I grew up. I was lucky. We had one girl who was kind of mean, but she left me alone. I think I looked like I was going to cry, maybe. I don't know. Anyway.
Showed mercy, huh?
Nowadays, the bullying is much more intense, and some of these kids are actually hurting themselves, some even committing suicide. So stop and think about what you're doing is probably what we should be telling our kids. Don't follow, be a leader, and do the right thing. So childhood bullying can cause these problems to continue with these folks who were bullied until they're grown and they're, in their adult years. So we've got a doctor here, Dr. Andre Sarander. He's a professor of child psychology. He's in Finland at the University of Turku, and he has published some research studies he has done, and we're calling these startling findings. If a scientist has some startling findings, he has some results that are kind of shocking to people. Startling is another way to say, kind of shocked. If someone looks startled, then they're surprised. They're very kind of surprised and taken back. So findings or results. In JAMA, it's an acronym of a very famous medical journal. Research studies are published in these. It's the Journal of the American Medical Association. And other doctors and scientists must approve the study and say, yeah, that study is an accurate one. We believe that the techniques used were good. So people tend to trust the studies in this journal. It was in the JAMA Psychiatry Journal. So it's all about mental things, mental issues, psychiatric issues. This was back in 2012. What did he find, Tom?
Well, Sarander found that 23% of the bullied children he tracked sought help for a mental illness by the age of 30. So that's almost a quarter of children or people actually, who were bullied as children would later look for a psychologist. They would talk to a doctor or something and maybe get some kind of medication or psychotherapy or something. And they all did this before they turned 30 years of age. So that does seem like a fairly large number. And that, of course, does not take into account maybe the ones who are too afraid to talk to a psychologist. They're just living with it, and they're probably living in terror and pain and stuff like that.
Well, we've got some U.S. studies showing that up to 28% of children between these grades of 6 and 12, that's junior high and high school, who were bullied, they have bullying-related PTSD. That's almost 30%. So it's a problem that can't be ignored. Now, besides the injuries that may result from physical bullying, maybe a kid gets his arm broken or, is hit in the face, has some bruises, we don't know. The humiliating or mean comments, these are the things that really last, I think. Your body can heal, but when someone makes you feel stupid and someone who isn't valued, it can really hurt these kids in their self-confidence. So the mean comments and behaviors that are used by bullies that they employ here just means the behaviors and things they use. So employ just means use here. They can cause a range of emotions. It won't bother some people. They might be mildly embarrassed. Mild is not very strong. On a range or scale, it's towards the very, first part of the scale. If the worst is 10, mild is probably 1 or 2. Embarrassment is when something happens that makes you very self-conscious. Maybe you fall down on the sidewalk and everybody sees you and you just want to kind of, die because it's embarrassing. So your face turns red. Well, some kids can feel mild embarrassment, and the other extreme on the scale, or this range, is extreme fear. Some of these kids are actually threatened with death. Some of these high school kids can get pretty awful.
There are lots of videos on YouTube showing kids crying because they don't want to go to school because they've been bullied so much. So, indeed, they have this extreme fear. And adult survivors may continue to experience powerlessness, anger, and even terror. So, if you're an adult and you were bullied as a kid, these feelings will continue on into adulthood. You'll continue to feel powerlessness, that you can't really change the situation. And you'll feel anger, of course. You'll really want to get back at that bully if you ever have a chance. And you feel terror. You may be afraid not just of the bully himself, but of other people around you who may resemble that person or who may remind you of that situation, things like that.
Right. So when you use this word manifest, it just means to show. These feelings might manifest themselves or be clear or obvious to people. So to manifest something is to display or show it. That is a good word to use. It's a little bit, I was going to say more gougy, it's a higher
advanced
level vocabulary word. So these feelings might be shown as nightmares. Maybe that's the way it's manifest or displayed. They'll have nightmares, social anxiety. A lot of kids, they don't want to go to school, like Tom was saying. Some people have panic attacks. I've seen that. That's awfully scary. Or here's another one, avoidance of certain situations. Avoidance is the noun form of the verb to avoid. When you avoid something, you keep away from it, or you stop yourself from doing something. I like to avoid going to the dentist. You guys know, if you listen to the program, I don't love the dentist. I know they help us, but that's okay. They scare me. Avoidance is the noun form, so avoidance of something. So they avoid certain situations and behaviors and the development of risky coping mechanisms. Risky just means something that could lead to danger. It's something that's not safe.
Right, so coping, of course, refers to being able to cope or deal with a situation, and a mechanism, of course, is the way that you cope, the way that you deal with a situation.
And I think they're referring to things like taking drugs, starting to drink alcohol, doing things that will eventually hurt them even more. That's a coping mechanism.
And those are risky, of course. If you get addicted to drugs, you might have some problems there. You might end up in jail and stuff like that. And we've mentioned all sorts of stuff here, so we've got this phrase, all of which means basically all of these things that we mentioned are characteristic of PTSD. These are like symptoms of this particular disorder, so watch out for that. And these problems can have dreadful consequences affecting people's health, career, and relationships. So yes, we can see that childhood bullying can still affect you if you are an adult. Okay, that brings us to the end of our explanation for today. Here comes our Chinese teacher.
好，文章作者在第3段开头提到 childhood bullying, in fact, can cause many more problems later in life than we are led to believe. 童年时期霸凌经验往往在往后的人生引发的问题远比我们以为的多很多。 他更进一步引用了研究数据，说明霸凌的严重性。第4段则具体说明霸凌造成的心理伤害有哪些，延伸到成年之后又会造成哪些 PTSD 的症状。我们现在一起来看一下后面2段的重要句型、单词和片语。请同学看到第3段的第2句。好，请看到 Dr. Ander Salrander 这位博士，他在美国医学学会期刊上发表了一些令人震惊的发现。请同学把 publish some startling findings 画起来，就是发表令人震惊的发现。那 publish 不只有出版的意思，这里呢我们可以把它解释成发表。接着呢，请看到第3个句子。第3个句子 Surrounder found that 23% of the bullied children who he trapped。 好，请同学呢帮老师把 bullied children 跟 he trapped 中间补上个 who。 那由于这个 who 是当后面关系子句的受词，所以可以省略。就 Surrounder 他发现了这些受到霸凌的儿童，哪些儿童呢？他所追踪的这些受到霸凌的儿童有 23% 寻求协助。好，那接下来我们看到第4个句子 With some US studies showing that up to 28%， 这边请同学特别注意到，这里因为是在 with 后面， with 是一个介系词，后面不可以加一般的动词，所以 show 我们要加上 ing。有一些美国的研究显示。好的，接下来请看到第4段的第1句，请同学特别注意到，在逗点之后 the humiliating or mean comments and behaviors that bullies employ， 请同学把 employ 画起来，这个动词很重要，意思就是使用的、运用。好，就是这些霸凌的人，他们所运用的羞辱啊，或者他们所说的这些非常恶毒的话，或者不好的行为等等。接下来，请同学看到第3个句子 These feelings might manifest as nightmares。 这边好，请同学特别注意到这个 manifest 我们把它解释为显现。好，那最后呢，请同学看到逗点之后All of which are characteristic of PTSD。 同样的，请同学注意到这个 which 它是关系代名词，所代替的就是前面的。从 nightmares 开始一连串到后面的 development of risky coping mechanisms， 那这一些包括噩梦啊、社会焦虑等等，都是 PTSD 典型的症状。以上就是我们针对这一天课文的中文讲解，谢谢大家。
That is it for our program today, but we do beg you to come back and join us again next time. We'll all have a good time. From all of us here at English Digest, I'm Tom.
I'm Stephanie.
Bye.
Bye.